of shaping. Shaping, as defined on page 109 of our textbook, is the term used in behavioral learning theories to refer to the teaching of new skills or behaviors by reinforcing learners for approaching the desired final behavior. Ever since we first learned about shaping in our readings, I thought it was a very structured way to teach students, especially in math. I tried it out in my classroom with a skill that I had been teaching for a couple of weeks, and the change in how well the students grasped the concept was undeniable. The numerous days spent struggling to get all my students on board with this skill. After the first day I tried shaping, the majority of the class showed mastery of the skill for the first time. So ever since that day, I've researched more about the technique and tried it on new and different skills and worked to perfect it in my teaching. The idea of teaching in a step-by-step manner that reinforces every step of a skill has transformed the way I approach each new lesson. I've found that beginning my lesson with demonstrations and following that up immediately with shaping as the students attempt the new skill promotes mastery at a much faster pace than I'd seen before. I've even gone back and retested on that first skill that I used shaping to teach to make sure that my students are retaining the information with success. There was an 86% mastery on the first test and an 81% mastery on the retest. So those are wonderful results for my students, many of whom are on a remedial level. I chose to do this pencil drawing because it's representative of the concept of shaping that I have in my head. For each lesson that I break down into very structured steps, I sort of see this image in my head. I'm not an overly creative person as a rule, so trying to draw something that shows a concept that I have in my head was somewhat out of my comfort zone, but I thought I'd give it a try. I picture the numbers of the steps that it takes to solve a problem sort of melding together because after many times practicing a new skill, the steps just kind of blend together and the students seem to forget eventually that they even needed the steps and they just solve the problem with that final point of acquiring that skill. But when the students reach that goal, there's a new skill right around the corner every time, so the cycle starts again. So this is how the shaping works in my head, and my students seem to respond beautifully to this model. My reinforcement is very structured from the beginning because when I'm planning my lessons now, I define for myself every small goal I want the students to reach. This seemed kind of petty almost to begin with because I thought it seemed like overkill. But I had to remind myself that math doesn't come as easy to some of my students as it does to me now, so I have to think about what is an attainable goal for them at each step. Once I define those small goals with the larger end goal in mind, it's much easier to see why this method works. Looking at the big picture is too much for many of my students, but when they have what they perceive to be a more reasonable goal, they're encouraged and they perform much better. The stress levels have definitely decreased in my class, and that's a success in and of itself for math. When a student reaches a small goal and receives the praise and reward of doing so, he's much more involved in the lesson and they actually seem to want to learn in order to reach that next level. I can really see how this method can be beneficial in any discipline, particularly with struggling learners who have either always been told they're inferior to other students or have just convinced themselves that they're inferior to other students. So these students need the positive reinforcement that this method brings, and they respond to it with overwhelming success. The most difficult thing for me is to think about what problems students will have with the concept and then break it down into chunks they can absorb. And as we continue our readings in the textbook, we're learning much more about how the human brain absorbs that information and processes it into actual learning. And so that's just reinforcing for me why shaping works.